Welcome to the Building a Customer API Zoom meetup, where we interview an engineer from a high-profile company that's recently felt the pain of building a public customer or partner-facing API. Then we open up the floor to attendees, see if they've got any questions about building APIs that we can help get them answered. I'm your host, Josh Twist. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Zuplo, which is an API gateway that makes it easy to expose and share an API with external partners, external customers, or even internally. This week, I'm joined by Utsav Shah of Vanta.
Thank you for all of that information. I think I'm super happy to be here. I'm Utsav. I'm the platform team's tech lead at Vanta. Vanta is a security and compliance startup. We have roughly 40 to 50 engineers. To just give you like a sense of the scale of our like engineering team, we do like automatic security monitoring. So like making sure that your AWS resources are secure, like your databases are not listening on the public internet, stuff like that. And we help you go through your compliance processes quickly. So like if you have a SOC 2 or an ISO that you need to get done quickly, we're here to help. We'll introduce you to an auditor and stuff. We've traditionally worked really well with startups, and we're slowly evolving to larger companies like mid-market. And you can imagine for a product like ours, bigger customers need more customizability, right? Like they need to make sure, oh, my GitHub accounts have a certain username format, and that needs to map up to like my HR system. So in order to support all of these like interesting use cases, we launched a public API. Right now it's in like public beta. So any of our customers can use it. And I was involved in working on all of the infrastructure pieces to like getting it like alpha ready. So making sure that any other developer at our company can just easily add an endpoint. They don't need to think about infrastructure. They don't need to think about like Terraform or anything. They just add a new route and they're good to go. So I worked on all of the infrastructure, the rate limiting, making sure like our latency isn't terrible, all of that stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Actually, let's just talk about your tech stack for a minute as well.
Mm-hmm.
You folks build on AWS or GCP or private data centers?
Yeah. So we are a very, like I would say 2017 tech stack. It's fully TypeScript, like front end, back end. We use GraphQL for everything. We launched our like API in GraphQL as well. Very single cloud AWS right now. We have no plans of being multi-cloud anytime soon. And we use Terraform to provision all of our infrastructure, but it's all mostly just configuring AWS, and like our database is Mongo. So we do a bunch of configuring through Terraform for our Mongo database as well. Yeah.
And so the actual API that you built that is like a Node backend. You code in TypeScript, is that right?
That's exactly right. And if you want, I can go through like the life of a request, like how does a request go from like a user to our system?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, essentially, as soon as the request starts from a client, it hits AWS API Gateway. That's the first step. And all of the intermediate layers, like, CloudFront or whatever, I'm not exactly sure how those things work. But the first thing from my perspective is it hits API Gateway. API Gateway hits a particular service that we've set up just for this, like an API external service is what we call it. Based on the request, like that service checks auth and all of the other things. It verifies like, oh, is this API token valid or not by making a bunch of database calls. And then it actually like executes on the request. So since it's a GraphQL request, it parses the document. We use your standard Apollo server and all of that. It parses that request, does some business logic, and returns data. Yeah.
Awesome. And that's HTTP. Oh, my camera's frozen. HTTP API and using JSON primarily as the sort of the protocol, as the format of data going over the wire. Oh, yeah, it's GraphQL, so of course.
Yeah. It's GraphQL. So I guess it's kind of JSON-like, but it's GraphQL. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. You mentioned something interesting. You mentioned that you use AWS API Gateway, but then it sounded like you were using tokens. Like, tell me about the authentication. How do consumers of your API authenticate?
Yes. So we had to basically build our whole authentication by hand. So we have like a database collection for like API tokens. When a user creates an API token on our app, it essentially like hashes that token and saves it in this collection. And when a user authenticates, the request goes from API Gateway to our service. Our service checks against this database collection and decides, is this API token legit? Is it expired or not? And that's how we determine who the user and stuff is. Like, so our gateway doesn't help us with authentication at all. Our backend service has to do all of that work. And I wish that weren't the case, but that's how it is today. Yeah.
Interesting. And I'm curious, why did you choose like API keys? I think we refer to them here at Zuplo versus like JOT tokens, JSON Web Tokens and an OAuth flow. Is there a reason you went with tokens?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. You actually have a blog about, the advantages of API keys versus like JWT, but essentially it's some of the advantages you list out, right? You have this opaque identifier. People can't just decrypt and see what the value is, or try to understand how our system works behind the scenes. It's pretty opaque to them. There are some other nice advantages. For example, if you have a prefix on your tokens, similar to like if you have seen Stripe APIs, we have like a VTS, like a Vanta simple prefix on our tokens that enables us to do things like GitHub security scanning. So anyone who's leaked a token can immediately find out, and we will find out that they've leaked a token, we can disable it. So there's these neat features that you get from API keys versus like JWTs or something else. And OAuth is a bit too heavy-handed for the flows that we were trying to enable. We weren't trying to do something interesting like authenticate on behalf of someone else. What we were trying to enable is, can I simply tweak some data in my application? It's too much work for me to do this in the UI. I need to do this on a continuous basis. There's an exact way I need to run this. I want to try exporting some of my data. So OAuth was just too heavy-handed for this use case.
Perfect. And we talked actually quite a while ago now. And I did, honestly, just for the audience here, we've not done a pre-call or some sort of like provisional. I have no idea how Utsav's going to answer these questions. I certainly did not expect you to cite our blog. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's great. We're obviously very aligned in terms of why we think that's an interesting option.
Mm-hmm.
So you built this yourself. You've got a database where you store all these things. I assume, how do the developers that consume the API, how do they get the key? Do you email it to them? They request it on a Google form? You have a built-in UI or something?
Yeah, so we have a built-in UI. That's another thing that we had to build ourselves. So it's like just on our app, like the admins of the app can create an API token. It's very similar to what you would have seen on a GitHub or a Datadog. As soon as you click the token, like the create button, you can set up scopes and stuff like that. Eventually, right now, we don't even have support for scopes, but you can set up names and descriptions and like when this token's supposed to expire. I think that's the fields we support today. Once you create a token, we show you like a one-time, this is the value of this token. We're never going to show you this again because we won't have access to it either. We're just going to hash and save it. So this is one time, copy it right now. It's going to go away. You need to use it then. And that's how we show it. So we don't email them. We don't store tokens like themselves in our database anywhere. We just store the hashed values. And I mean, all of you might be familiar with the Heroku hack that's happened where somebody got access to all of their OAuth access tokens. We never want to be in a situation like that. So we don't store anything unhashed. Yeah.
So it sounds like a fairly complex system. You mentioned, and obviously this serves my needs well, but I'm just curious. You mentioned that you wish your gateway did it. You had to build it yourself. Like, how long did it take? Like, how was it a lengthy process? Like, tell me about building and living with that thing.
Yeah, so building it took a while. Like first someone had to spec out, what is this token format going to look like? Where is it going to save? There's somebody, like, we're a pretty security minded company. We help you with your security practices. So we try to be scrappy in most things, but we try not to make trade-offs when it comes to like, oh, this is less secure versus something else. So we have a couple of like senior security engineers who suggested a bunch of things, and there was a little bit of back and forth there. Some of them gave the idea of like the GitHub security scanning stuff. So that specking out took a little bit of time. And all that backend code, of course, to like create API tokens, delete API tokens, expire API tokens, stuff that took Not as much, not too long. There weren't any unexpected bumps because it's basically reading and writing the database in a particular format. In our case, it was slightly more interesting primarily because of GraphQL. There's not that many people who expose public GraphQL APIs. There's a bunch of people who use them internally. But in our case, like just given our constraints, if we're not trying to be an API that is available to like millions of developers, that only our customers can use it. We are like a B2B company. We have a few thousand customers. And traditionally, it's okay if there's like a little more uh, of friction in that experience, just because like the trade-off of that versus, us supporting GraphQL internally, but exposing REST externally was just too much of like an engineering burden of the rest of the team that would be ongoing. So we decided we're going to just expose a similar GraphQL API. But in order to expose that, there aren't that many great primitives out there, especially around rate limiting, right? Like you could send us a GraphQL query that requests millions and millions of objects. And there wasn't something that was super easy and just like a library that you could use to block a request like that. There were some that were like query complexity checkers and stuff like that. None of them worked with the standard like GraphQL pagination spec. So it's like we follow the GraphQL like relay style pagination spec. None of the libraries supported that. We had to build our own. That took a while. So that was like the larger piece. And then all of the scaffolding around the actual API token management, and then the front end to actually show API tokens, create them, delete them, all of that stuff also took a bit. So overall, I would say standing up this API probably took a couple of months. Yeah. And this isn't even counting all of the wrangling we had to do with Terraform to make API Gateway happy. Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned rate limiting as well. So I'm curious, why did you put rate limiting in place? I mean, it seems implicitly obvious, but I'm like curious, what were your concerns specifically?
Yeah, so maybe a little bit of my background. I worked for like a slightly larger B2C, B2B2C company, Dropbox, before Vanta, right? And I worked on one of the teams that served Dropbox.com. So my pager went off if Dropbox.com went down, right? And we had a bunch of different clusters, like for our API, for www, it's like www.dropbox.com. And you would always see these scripts that, just by mistake, hammering us with requests, right? Like it wasn't intended. You would see these patterns. Like there's tons of people who have cron jobs that go off on the hour. So you would have something like 20,000 requests per second generally, like during regular hours, and then that's spiking to 100,000 during the minute every hour, like the first minute of every hour. So you would see all these patterns, and it's just like, developers create bugs, developers hammer APIs. It's just scary to launch an API for the first time, because the first time somebody can programmatically interact with your database, right? So we just wanted to make sure that anybody using the API cannot take down the main application for our customers who are not using the API. That was just really important to us. Yeah.
So for the record, I've lived this nightmare many times. I remember working on an API when I was back in the UK as an engineer. It was for a large travel company. We shipped it, and our partner on the first day wrote a clumsy for loop and didn't just take down the API, they took down everything. Our whole business went offline. And it's safe to say I never ship without rate limiting anymore if I'm going to ship an API. Funny enough, I was actually at again, I didn't know how you were going to answer these questions, but I was at I gave a keynote presentation this morning at a conference in Romania, remotely, obviously, because I'm still in Seattle. And this is one of the slides. I don't know if you guys can see this. I'm sharing here, where I say, when I'm having conversations about rate limiting, people are like, oh, I'm not worried about rate limiting. A hacker's not going to take me down. Hackers aren't interested in me. And it's like, yeah, it's never a hacker that's going to take you down. It's always your customer. So yeah, that totally makes sense to me. And like rate limiting, like how do you approach it? Do you have any complexity in there? Is it just IP based, or do you do something smarter, user based? Like what are the rules around how you set the rate limits for the incoming request?
Yeah, so I have one anecdote to just add about rate limiting even before I answer that question. One of the experiences that we had was Kanye West's album, like his new album, leaked on Dropbox. And so everyone hit that shared link, and that caused a bunch of issues for us. It's like, I know
Wow.
exactly what you mean, right? Things like that. And then we got like our team basically down the management chain. Probably Kanye texted our CEO and it went down the management chain, and like somebody got pinged saying, can you please block that link? Like, we don't want this to leak, and somebody got paged for it. But in terms of rate limiting, I'm again not a fan of rebuilding the wheel. Like, I don't want to introduce like a Redis or like a Memcache as another critical piece of infrastructure in the request serving path, right? So let me walk you through my decision making process.
Mm,
Today, when somebody sends a request to Vanta, essentially there's the backend service that's involved, and there's the database, and then there's a bunch of proxies in the middle, and like those proxies are managed by AWS. Should be okay in most cases, right? Let's say we introduce like a Redis or a Memcache, right? Today we don't have that. We don't have the operational maturity. We don't have toolings. Like, we have to start figuring out things like, can we log into this Redis? Can any engineer, should our team be able to log into this Redis in case it's down, right? So there's this extra infrastructural piece, which like it's only there to protect us. But now if this piece goes down, rate limiting will not work. And now then the question is, should you fail open or should you fail closed? Let's say
mm,
Redis goes down, right? Should you block user requests? That's bad because now Redis is extremely critical. Should you allow user requests? Then what's the point? Like, imagine somebody rate limiting, sending you so many requests that it takes down a piece like Redis. Now you're just going to take down your database.
mm.
So in my mind, it was like, I don't want to introduce an extra infrastructural piece unless I have to. And AWS's API Gateway has this jank feature where it's called like a custom authorizer. And that's how you can set up rate limiting. So it lets you either use this hard-coded header called x-api-key and say rate limit based on that. Or you can say you can transform this request using a Lambda, and that Lambda is called a custom authorizer. So I can take the authorization header that my customers send me and the API key is there. I can transform that into a format that AWS API Gateway understands, saying this is how you identify a customer using the authorization key. So I have this 30-line Lambda that just does this transformation and tells API Gateway, look, this is the name of this customer. And then API Gateway itself can rate limit for us. So in API Gateway, you can confirm, like you can configure it to say something like, for each user, or like this particular usage ID is how they call it, don't allow more than 100 requests a second.
Right.
It's a very, very terrible workflow. They don't allow more than 10,000 AP or like users, and like by default that limit is like 500. So we've already gone back and forth with support asking them, can you increase that limit? We have a bunch of users of this API, but that's the current state of the world. Yeah.
It makes sense. So to recap, then it seems like you think that the ideal rate limiting is you can do it by specific user. So if you have a premium customer,
Exactly.
that they might get 10,000 per minute. If you have a free customer, they're going to get 10 per minute. You know, you need to be able to
Exactly.
like control it. IP doesn't work. Just setting a flat rate limit for every user doesn't work. You need some sort of higher level of control.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
okay,
Mhm.
okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Awesome. And what do you do about metrics and observability for this API? You know, I mean, let's start with metrics. Do you like check in and see like how busy the thing is? Is that something you look at frequently?
Yeah, I do, right? Because the thing with APIs is like you often have these like power users, or like these users who would like send
Mm,
you 5,000, 10,000 requests. And then a lot of users sending you a few requests. So I have a dashboard. The dashboard's based on in Datadog. And the idea is that we try to get metrics from API Gateway itself. The reason why I'm a big believer in gateways, we didn't have an API Gateway until we had this project. And I strongly believe that we shouldn't be just sending requests to an ALB. We should have an API Gateway in the middle because of all of these pieces, right? There's these pieces on rate limiting. It's also the central hub for observability. It produces metrics for us. It tells us how many 400s we're getting, how many times somebody gets rate limited. I just stuff all that onto a dashboard. API Gateway has an inbuilt integration with Datadog, so I don't even have to create custom like metrics or figure all of that stuff out, like all of those configuration pieces. Maybe a little bit of Terraform hacking again, but that gets me enough metrics to just see things like how many requests I'm getting. And the second piece is like the company that there's this company called Apollo, which manages the GraphQL open source libraries and stuff. They also have a product that helps you get observability, helps you with API documentation and all that. So that's another product we use. We log every request. Apollo is just much smarter about GraphQL. They know the names of operations and how people are querying your data and stuff like that. They have an API explorer. If you want, I can share my screen to show you what it looks like, because this is all public. I don't have to hide any of this.
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
Let me pull it up. One sec.
Whilst you're doing that, I would say to folks on the call, if you have any questions you want to start asking, please feel free to put them in the chat window for now. We may open up live conversation at the end as well if people want to ask in person. But if you've got anything you want to ask Utsav, please just drop it into the chat.
Yep. So I'm just like, if anybody goes to this URL, so I'm not even logged into my work profile over here, you'll see that we have like an API explorer and everything. It has like documentation, like you can actually see for the organization field, this is the huge list of things you can query. And like, let's go into one specific thing. So like policies, so like give me the most recent policies of each type, and if they're approved or not. So like GraphQL lets you do all that. And here's like an example. It's like, give me my recent test results for my organization, get my current list of test results, right? So I guess the point here is you can easily host things like an API explorer on your API page that makes it easy for people to develop on. And Apollo is the company that lets you do that. So this was, of course, very important for us. Like, we want to reduce the friction as much as possible, but we didn't want to add significant engineering costs by maintaining a REST API. So this is the best we came up with.
Interesting. And your users use that to learn the API, like they're active on doing that?
Yeah, this is what they use. We have this particular explorer also sends us a header saying, or like a user agent saying that the requests come in the explorer, so we can see that people are actually using the explorer, and that's what they can use. You can paste in your token. Once you're happy, just transfer it to your code base.
When people are building APIs, they share, like, I think there's like a couple of scenarios, right? There's APIs you build for your own team that your own web client's using, right? Very internal. Then there's perhaps at slightly larger organizations, there's APIs you build that perhaps another department will use, and it becomes a little bit less close a relationship. You know, that it's almost like an external company. And then there's the totally external company scenario. What I see is in those two external company scenarios, there tends to be two approximate groups. One is I kind of have like self-serve, where people are going to come up and use this API. Maybe they're already a customer. Like, I assume I have to be a Vanta customer to use this API. You don't just let me come and play with other people's data. And then there's a scenario where, you know, you have limited number of partners, and you tend to onboard them very manually. Like, I see this like with marketplaces, for example, where most of their clients are manually configuring the products in the UI, but then there's just some giant customer like Wayfair shows up and they want to use an API. Where does Vanta fit? Is Vanta more in the self-serve?
So I would say we're certainly not on the extremes of that spectrum. Sure. This particular API is probably closer to self-serve, but I would say only 60%, right? An example is that one of the larger customers said that they wanted to use the API. They weren't really sure. We have solutions engineers who can help them figure out, can our API support this thing? These are the kind of requests you want to make. And then eventually, once we have that, partner can probably write the script on their own, or the customer can write the script on their own. So it's on that where we will help them use the API because they are our customers, but we probably won't run the code that they have written. They will probably have to manage it. It's probably an engineer we're talking to. So closer, just not completely self-serve, where you have to email support and you might not get a response. Like, you will get a response. You will get a solutions engineer helping you.
And so when you say 60%, does that mean 60% of of consumers that show up to use the API completely satisfy themselves? Or do you mean every customer gets about 60% of the way and then you need 40% to get them over the line?
No. I was just thinking if you take that, I should probably clarify this. So like 0% is something like it's a very manual process. It's very partner, like very
Yep.
like hands-on, and 100% is completely self-serve. We're probably not right in the middle of that bell curve. Like we're probably on the right a little bit, like
Got
closer to
it.
self-serve. Yeah.
Got it. And the thing that enables that is the things like the documentation that you get out of Apollo. That's really what makes that happen. Do you also have supplementary documentation, like a getting started guide? Like,
Yep.
how do you?
That's yeah. Sorry for interrupting, but
No,
basically
that's good.
there's another page called developer.vanta.com, which gives you a quick starts. Like here are the list of things you need to follow: making an API token, exploring the graph, start sending requests, code samples. This is all hosted by README, as you can see.
Yeah.
And then there's links to the API console itself. So we try to make it as simple for you as possible. It's like we use GraphQL. Here's the tutorial. Start sending requests, examples in Python and JavaScript and curl. And this is how we try to make things simple. Some of the complicated things with GraphQL is pagination. So we try to give very specific examples about how you can fetch paginated data, like what you need to do. You need to pass in these parameters and stuff like that. Yeah.
What made you document, like, this is quite an interesting example. What made you document the pagination problem? Was it because your instinct told you, hey, pagination's hard, or did you start getting feedback from customers struggling with it, and so you started to change the docs to meet that need?
It's just our instinct from internal developers. So our internal developers have traditionally found our pagination concepts like extremely tricky. And it's not like we have built something in-house. This is the relay style pagination, the GraphQL way of doing things. They have these specific parameters. And I think it's really built for this use case of infinite feeds, right? Like Facebook is like the original main example. So and I think they have really good ideas, right? You don't want to make like per page counts or anything like that, because that might change over time, especially if you're Facebook. There might be new posts that come in, and we like that pattern. We like cursors, but then cursors are slightly complicated because you also need to specify, if I'm at a cursor, give me 20 items, right? So, and then sometimes you might also want to specify like back pagination. Like, what if I want to go through this list, but the other way around? In hindsight, maybe we should just have never supported that, but we just wanted to be conforming to the spec. So we supported it, but that makes things complicated because there's like a bunch of numerical parameters. There's cursor, which are like opaque strings. And internally, people have always struggled with it, like almost so that we almost have like an onboarding task, which is like use GraphQL pagination as one of the onboarding tasks. You don't have to ask us like 3 months in when you're really confused about the thing. And then we have like internal style guide and stuff. So based on that, we knew that pagination would be tricky.
Actually, one last question on this area. I've had a few chats with folks, and your decision to go GraphQL versus, say, HTTP JSON REST. You mentioned earlier that you felt it was sort of quicker for you to get to market, I think, rather than building out or designing even a REST API. Was that right? That was one of the reasons?
It's quicker to market, plus it would not be too much skew against our existing internal systems. So like this particular API, we wanted to expose pretty much most of the data that you might be able to see on our UIs. That's why we have so many fields. Now, trying to maintain an internal GraphQL client and an internal REST client, the REST one has to be really stable because people outside are using it. There was too much skew. Plus, yeah, we would probably be really slow. No, but we would also be really slow in actually launching it, right? It would just take a lot of time.
One thing I've heard, though, is sort of the opposite case. I'm curious how you feel about this, is that on the other side, a lot of folks find GraphQL hard to get to grips with. Actually, you kind of hinted at this at the beginning, whereas they find REST more simple for the consuming developer. Like everybody knows REST pretty much, right? You can mess up a REST design, of course, but assuming you do a reasonable job. Does that sound right to you? I mean, what do you think about that?
I think it sounds right in the sense of when you've never seen GraphQL before, it is harder to grok. It's harder to understand the concepts. It just feels so different, right? It doesn't feel like my JSON schemas. It doesn't feel like OpenAPI. the tooling support isn't there yet in the community. Like I'll give you an example from readme.com, right? They support all of these nice features, which like import an open API spec, and then automatically you can start sending requests. It'll validate stuff for you. GraphQL, it's like that support is in beta. The functionality barely works. Like ideally, we would just converge on readme.com for all of our documentation needs, but we had to use Apollo. So, and I think the concepts are slightly more tricky. It also feels alien if you haven't used it and you've been hitting REST APIs all your life. It's one of those things where when we see people use it over time, right, internally at our company, the fact that you get these strongly typed results, which you kind of get with like Open API, but this is just automatically idiomatic TypeScript code gets generated. Your automatic like React hooks and like all of that get generated as well. It just gets really easy to iterate once you have enough examples. And we've never seen someone complain about GraphQL 3 months in. 3 months in, almost everybody is like, I'm so happy we use GraphQL, or I'm not mad at it, which is like a pretty high standard for a developer tool. It's like, I'm not mad at this thing. It's like, this is great, right? Like that means you're happy. And GraphQL is probably the thing that people don't complain a lot about versus something like a Mongo, which is, 6 months in, 9 months in, it's like, we should just use something relational. Why the heck are we using this thing? Yeah.
Interesting. One question I got from somebody recently who was about to embark on an API sharing exercise, much like you did at Vanta, was what sort of is the ideal team for this? And that probably varies a little bit by stage. Like at a tiny startup, it's like an engineer builds it and you ship it and you're done. How did you think about this at Vanta? I know you have PMs. I know one of your PMs there. That's how we got connected. What's an ideal team? Like 2 engineers, 1 PM, a TPM? Like, what do you think it looks like, and how would you think about that?
Yeah. So you're asking, just to confirm my understanding, like if you want to start shipping an API, what's the ideal team structure to make that happen?
I mean, I guess to clarify, I think if I understand correctly, you had an API internally to some degree, right? And then you made a decision that you needed to support external partners calling that API. And so then you had to do a bunch of work like set up AWS, build your key management system, integrate the key management into the portal, do rate limiting, all that stuff. So when it comes to that sharing exercise, like you've probably got your core business logic working somewhere, you're going to need to do some transformation. That project of like, hey, we're going to have an external API, we have an internal, we're going to have an external one. Like, how would you think about ideally sizing that team for someone like Vanta?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think if you decompose the problem, it goes around all the constraints that we've somewhat talked about throughout this call. There's this concept of if you have that little bit of experience knowing that you should be making sure your external API is stable. Like you don't want that to change as much as your internal one. Like you probably want your internal one to change very fast. You need someone who has kind of seen that a little bit, right? You want someone to have that experience in the sense of probably we should think about rate limiting early. Imagine if you set this up without a gateway at all, and then you have the backfill rate limiting into that. So I would say the team size is not as important maybe as just a couple of people who've seen this problem before, who have experience, who are like, I don't need to rebuild this thing. Let me see what's out there on the market. Let me see what's out there in my cloud. Like maybe GCP has a feature that lets me do this easily. I don't just want to expose my Lambda or my service on a URL and just give that URL to people. So I think you want a couple of engineers with that experience, depending on the complexity of your setup. Our setup was not extremely complicated. Like all of our stuff is containerized. There's a bunch of Node.js services, and there was an ALB, which was like an internal ALB, and then there was like a public ALB. That's how our existing setup worked. So like if you go to the app, it's a public ALB. It talks to the internal ALB, which talks to our internal services. Not super complicated. There's a few hops, right? So based on that, we didn't actually need too many engineers to spin up this like alternative serving path. But the important piece was the gateway. So making sure that a gateway exists so that tomorrow when we want to think about rate limiting, tomorrow when we want to say, actually this request should go to this other service, we don't change that in the service itself, we change it in the gateway. So that experience. And then yes, a PM, right? A PM who ideally knows that these developer style products are slightly different from shipping a regular feature, or they're scrappy enough that they can learn that, right? Like it takes time for people to build using an API. You can't just launch an API and wait a week and like you have hundreds of users. That's not how API development works. So someone who has that ability to be patient, to help partners out or customers out, go on a call with them, ask them, what are you struggling with? So it doesn't have to be too big, right? Especially if your infrastructure is not that complicated. And then again, if your infrastructure gets more complicated, you need more people, right? If you have to think about, how do I get my API gateway to talk to like 5 different services? Maybe you need more like infra-minded people to think about that.
Awesome. Awesome.
Mhm.
The deployment of Vanta and this API, is it all in, I'm only sure what you're allowed to, obviously, but is it all in one location, or do you have it in multiple locations? Are you running at the edge or anything crazy like that?
Yeah, so the gateway itself is deployed at the edge, I believe, but the services themselves are a single region, multiple AZs. Yeah.
Got it. And do you do any caching at all of responses? It's always like live
No,
read from Apollo. Okay,
live read.
awesome.
Yeah.
And I have less knowledge about this in GraphQL, so I'm curious about your answer. How do you think about versioning? Like, I think you're still on version 1, I'm guessing, because you're
Mhm,
still in alpha or beta or whatever.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah, what's the versioning strategy?
Yeah, so I actually had a talk with the founder or like the creator of GraphQL, right? Where we spoke about this. Like if that's a small plug to if that conversation, if anybody is interested. But
Oh, wait a minute. Let
yeah,
me do the plug for you. So
yeah.
because I don't think that would have landed. Utsav has an awesome podcast called Software at Scale, and I actually listened to this episode. I forgot. I was like, "What do you mean you talked to him?" I listened to a podcast about. Oh, that was you. So Utsav has a podcast called Software at Scale. We'll put if we can, we'll send out the link to everybody who registered. We will send out the link to everybody who registered. And one of the people he talks to is the creator of GraphQL at Facebook, right? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. So, I mean, in that conversation, right, like versioning with GraphQL, the idea is that like it's very different from REST. From in REST, the best practice in my head is you version using the URL. So you have like a V1, you have like a V1 like on, and then when you want to do like a switch, you change your URL scheme. With GraphQL, the idea is you just expose a new field. The idea is that clients can decide which field they're requesting using the GraphQL query itself. So you can see exactly which client is requesting which field. And you can just tell them change the field, like use field V2 rather than field V1. There's just one big graph they query from. So it doesn't make sense to have like a different URL or anything like that. Just tell them to query something else. Yeah.
Interesting. And is that like you think that's a long-term, many-year strategy, or do you imagine that at some point maybe there is just a whole new GraphQL endpoint called V2 or something? Is that you don't think that'd ever happen?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure even facebook.com would have like facebook.com/GraphQL, and a different URL would probably never happen. Yeah. The idea is you can see exactly which client is requesting which field. And you can do things, you can have like a brownout on one field instead. So you don't need to do like a version bump. Yeah.
Awesome. Makes sense. So tell me, is there anything that we didn't talk about that was surprising to you when you embarked on this project, like that
Yeah.
we didn't pull up?
Yeah, I think we spoke about this on our podcast a little bit, but I was surprised at how slow API Gateway was and how cumbersome it was to configure these things, like things that you would imagine are bread and butter, right? In like
Just to be clear, you're talking about AWS API
AWS
Gateway here.
API, yeah. I wish I had seen Zuplo like a few months ago, but the idea is that we decided to go with AWS API Gateway. I didn't do a ton of research because I figured it's AWS's API Gateway. It's probably what they use for their systems. How bad could it be? But the latency is actually pretty interesting. Like when we did some tests, like, oh, this has pretty high latency. And then when I Googled around, it doesn't look like it's a me problem, right? It tells you specifically what the latency is of your integration. So in that case, that's our application and the gateway. And we basically on regular intervals see like an extra 50 to 100 milliseconds added for no rhyme or reason. And it's because we're a low volume API, I think, right? So they just don't have that many connections going from their gateway to our VPC. So then they need to spin that up. Maybe if we become like a high volume gateway, that'll get faster, but there is a surprising amount of latency in the system. And I mean, no one likes latency. Nobody likes to launch an API and slow on day one. So that's something that I would have probably thought about a little more, or like tested around with by, spinning up an API gateway in like the AWS console and verifying it. I was surprised at how much work it was to set up things like rate limiting, that the fact that they don't let you rate limit based on a configured header. And like, it's just a field that I can add. Like, I need to do all this work to set up a Lambda. Like we have a Lambda that just like is like a pure function of like 30 lines of code. And it's upsetting to me that I had to set that up. Why can't I just like write a field that says rate limit based on this header? That's all. I don't need to do anything more interesting than that. So it was just surprising the amount of Terraform hacking that I had to do in order to get this to work. And tomorrow, like, and we decided to start exposing more things on that API gateway. So then we started deciding to like split out the GraphQL stuff from the non-GraphQL pieces. That was a bunch of work again. Like Terraform and API gateway just don't really play well together at all. So I was surprised at the friction, I would say, of the whole process.
Interesting. I should note we are not paying Utsav for this call. I didn't know that you were going to say that when I said what the surprises were. And to some degree, that's one of the reasons we started Zuplo. Was we just didn't feel gateways were designed for developers and didn't, they were designed for sort of higher up decision makers and so on. So it fits. And we have heard other customers complain about latency. Even in high volume situations, it seems it can be spiky sometimes. We've seen as well. So that makes sense. But I appreciate that. The question, anything else that's not API gateway related in terms of like the project you took on that, I think you said it was a bit of a surprise, like how much work was involved to kind of get over the cliff, and anything specific or anything else we haven't mentioned?
In terms of the project, I think I would say anybody embarking on an API project, like just be prepared to be patient, be prepared to be helpful for your first set of customers. Your documentation is never going to be as good as it can be. People are just going to stumble over stuff that you didn't expect. There's so many assumptions you make when you launch an API product, because your company in and out, all the nouns and the verbs, right? You know that this field is supposed to mean this and not that. With an API project, just take your time, ship it incrementally, slowly, ship it to a few people, see what they say. It's like any other product development. It's just the feedback cycles are longer. So be prepared to wait. That's, I guess, my one piece of learning from the whole system on the whole project. Yeah.
And actually, what's the communication channels you use for that? Do you add folks to a Slack in the early, or to Discord, or just do it over email? Like, what did you find works well?
So initially we launched to like a few alpha partners, right? And people just took time to give feedback, right? What we ended up doing was we try to make the whole, since it's an alpha, you needed to sign like a terms and agreements thing, because it's a new product surface. You can use our systems programmatically now. Does that mean you can like try hammering each and every API? No. So you need to sign new terms and conditions. We try to make, we had a bunch of friction there, right? You had to sign like a DocuSign and all that. It was painful. We decided to make all of that in product, launched it to like a few alpha partners. They took a bunch of time to give feedback. And then we figured, you know what, let's just have a public alpha with like 100 people, or with more people than that. And what we changed in our launch strategy is now we just have a public beta with every single customer. We send them an email saying, here's this feature, use it if you want to. Because it's different from a regular beta where like if you ship a feature to someone who and they really care and it's really easy, you have a lot of people using it and now you can't change it. With an API, it's different. Tell them it's a public beta. Tell all your customers, or like, that's what we did after a while. Now we have a few users giving us feedback, and they just send it through the regular like support channel initially. And then we have like a dedicated Slack channel after that, which is we can go talk to you directly if you want more interactive feedback. So that was our like strategy on launching and then communicating. It's like, just launch to everyone initially, but tell them it's a beta, so things might break, and then have them go through the regular support channel, and then tell all your customer success and support people, use this Slack channel if they have API questions.
Awesome. That was great. Thanks so much, Utsav, for taking the time to chat. I
Mhm.
really enjoyed it. I know we've spoken before, but I learned a lot about your opinions. Some of it was quite favorable to us, so thank you.
Mhm.
I do want to open up the floor. We haven't had any questions come in on the chat yet. I'm just going to assume it's because we covered everything we need to cover. But if anyone does have a question, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask it live, or drop something into the chat. This is a good chance to ask somebody who's kind of been through all this pain, is still going through this process right now. Let's see if anyone's feeling brave. I know it's always a bit intimidating, isn't it? It's like join a public a public Zoom conversation and actually ask a question. I think we covered everything, Utsav. I think we nailed it. So I really enjoyed it. It was a great chat. Obviously, we so yeah, a little thank you there. Thanks, Jack. Thanks for coming along. Yeah, so it was great. I think hopefully people got a lot out of that. I think there's a lot of value in everything you said, and certainly aligns with a lot of how we think about things at Zuplo. I don't want to turn this into too much of a pitch, but we have tried to solve most of the things you've mentioned. You even talked about the GitHub key revocation process. And we actually have that as a feature. So if you use our API key management service, we'll take care of like dealing with GitHub, revoking the keys, emailing you, etc. We have GitOps that you can use Terraform, but we also have a really slick GitOps flow that's like Vercel. And when it comes to that rate limiting, there's no key limits, or even you don't even need to send an additional header. If you're using API keys, you can write code inside the gateway that says, I know this key is, who's the customer, how should I rate limit? And it's like 3 lines of JavaScript. It runs in the gateway. There's no need to set up a different Lambda or a different piece of code to do it. Just runs right neat inside the gateway. It's extremely high performance. So I know we were a little bit late to catch you, Utsav, and you'd already gone down that journey. But yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming along. Hopefully this was useful. I believe the plan is we'll put the recording out there for if you want to share it with your colleagues and so on. We'll send a follow-up email. We'll send a follow-up email that includes the link to Utsav's awesome podcast. And we'll probably run these again soon with another guest in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thanks all for listening.
Cheers. Thanks, folks. Thanks, Utsav.